Chapter 5. Mutation. We now know that a truth fully existing in the world can be determined as a maximal degree of self-identity, or will, in any case, be organized around a multiple having this existential property. This condition is, however, a structural one, and is, as such, satisfied by all bodies that fully exist in a world. We have yet to identify what makes a truth sufficiently exceptional to the laws of appearing for it to be able to hold universally or from one world to another. It's impossible to think anything other than that everything constituting an exception to the laws of the world results from a local modification of these laws themselves. Or, put more forcefully, albeit not entirely rigorously, every exception to these laws is the result of a law of exception. We must, in other words, assume that a truth is not a body subtracted from the transcendental prescriptions of appearing, but the consequence of a local modification of these prescriptions. To firmly grasp what this involves, let's define what constitutes a regular or internal change to the laws of appearing. If, for example, a plane tree has a viral disease causing it to lose its leaves and to wither, the system of its relations to the world, for instance, the density of the shadow it casts, greater than that dispensed by the small trees next to it, may well find itself modified. In this case, whereas the degree of identity between its shadow and the shade of its neighbors was previously weak, attesting to the much greater spread of its foliage, this degree now increases and even tends towards the maximal degree, as though the great tree found itself reduced to the level of a runt. Not only does this modification not affect the way in which the transcendental is set out, but, on the contrary, it presupposes it. It is only with regard to the stability of the relations between degrees and the pertinence of the connection between these degrees and the multiples appearing in the world that we can speak of the tree's decrepitude relative to its recent past. The change remains imminent to the laws. It's a simple modification, internal to the logical disposition of the world, a bit like Spinoza's mode, as an imminent and necessary inflection of the effects of the only power that exists, that of substance. Nor is it possible, moreover, to presuppose a sudden change of the transcendental itself, for the transcendental, strictly speaking, does not exist. It is the measure of all existence, without any manifestation being necessary on its part as such. Somewhat similarly, in the case of Spinoza, substance only exists as the internal production of its effects, the infinite multiplicity of its attributes in particular, such that it is just as possible to state that substance alone exists, or that only its attributes and modes do. The latter of these alternatives amounts to stating that substance does not exist. It's the same for the transcendental, as the locus of the relations of identity and difference by means of which multiples make worlds, and what does not exist cannot change. Finally, then, to set about thinking an exception in what appears or in what occurs, for it is the same thing, being, for its part, does not occur, it simply is. We need to locate this in the relation between a multiplicity and the transcendental. A multiplicity because whatever occurs is always local. The idea of a global exception makes no sense, for what would this be an exception to, given that everything is changed? Its relation with the transcendental, because this is what arrays the possibilities of appearing as such. Yet the relation between a determined multiplicity and the transcendental is precisely this multiplicity's appearing, evaluating the immanent relations of identities and differences between all its elements. We do not see how this relation as such can change in its principle without the world changing. It is, therefore, absolutely necessary to admit that real change, or mutation, consists in neither a global change of the transcendental, nor a change of the mode by which a multiple's elements are differentially evaluated by transcendental degrees. The only possibility is that a multiple is introduced in some sort of supplementary way within the register of appearing. Yet how can a multiple that is already there in the world and therefore already evaluated as regards its immanent resources in the register of appearing supplement the operation of transcendental rules? Or must we rather envisage a multiple's emanating from outside the world, like a meteorite of appearing? But why this one rather than another? All this seems the order of miracles. We must much rather rationally assume, 1, that the multiple localizing the situation is well and truly already there in the world, that it appears there. 2, that the transcendental of the world concerned is not modified in its internal rules. 3, that the supplementation by the multiple concerned maintains some relation with its link to the transcendental, for this supplementation would otherwise be floating or rootless with respect to this multiple's appearing as assumed in condition 1 above. The only option left open to us is to pose that there is a local mutation in appearing when a multiple itself falls under the measurement of identities rendering the comparison of its elements possible. Or, put another way, when appearing's basis in being comes to appear locally. Normally, a multiple is inscribed in the world by a degree of identity being assigned to every pair of its elements. A fundamental ontological law, commented on in Being and Event, Meditation 18, prohibits, however, any multiple from being an element of itself. As a result, the transcendental evaluation of identities and differences for any given multiple is immanent to this multiple, without the latter itself being taken into consideration. The measurement of the degrees of identity between the elements of the plane tree, such and such a leaf, or a branch and a root, etc., operates element by element, but does not include the plane tree itself. There is not, internally to the inscription of the plane tree within the world, any determination of a degree of identity between, say, the plane tree and a piece of its bark. Such a degree of identity can, of course, be part of a multiple's appearing in the world, but this multiple will not be the plane tree, any more than it will be the piece of bark. It has to contain both one and the other as elements. If, then, it so happens that a multiple falls under the protocol that immanently evaluates the network of relations constituting its appearing, there is an obvious transgression of the ontological and logical complex that brings a multiple being into appearing. This transgression, however, no more presupposes a supplementary multiple or a modification of the transcendental than it does an arbitrary indifference of the multiple's relation to its new entry within appearing, because it is under its own law of appearance that the multiple comes to be counted. As such, we satisfy the three conditions deduced above. We will name sight a multiple that comes to appear in a new way, insofar as it falls under the general measurement of the degrees of identity prescribing element by element its own appearing. Let us say that a sight itself is made to appear of itself. Un site se fait apparaître lui-même. Such is the formal principle of a mutation in appearing. A concise analysis shows there to be three types of mutation. First of all, according to the degree of existence possessed by the multiple when it falls under its own transcendental connection, the mutation is said to be a fact if this degree is not maximal, implying a local anomaly in the distribution of appearing's relations, Facts are more than the regular changes or modifications, a la Spinoza, we spoke of above, but nevertheless remain largely internal to appearing in its general form. Then, those sites having a maximal existential value are distinguished on the basis of the consequences and hence the power of the local mutation. In Chapter 4, we saw that every multiple possesses one and only one inexistent element. If this inexistent element remains invariable or simply acquires, under the effect of the mutation, an existence less than the maximum, the mutation will be described as a weak singularity. If the inexistent acquires a maximal existential value, the multiple will be said to be an event. In other words, an event is a site, a multiple itself falling under the law making its elements appear, that is in excess of both facts, for the site's value of existence is maximal, and weak singularities, for the inexistent, for its part, equally comes to exist with the maximal value. It is to be carefully noted that the characteristics of the event consist of reflexivity. The site belongs to itself, at least fleetingly, such that its multiple being comes to the surface of its appearing in person. Intensity, it exists maximally. And power, its effect extends as far as a complete raising up of the inexistent, from the minimal or nil value to the maximal value. We are nothing, let us be all, as sung in the Internationale. Of course, when it comes to giving an example of an event, we are unable to confine ourselves to empirical plane trees. I've proposed a great number of detailed examples in Logics of Worlds, of which we can cite here the insurrection of slaves under Spartacus' leadership, or the first day of the Paris Commune in politics, the Chauvet Cave artists' paintings of horses, or the architecture of Brasilia in the arts. Julie and Saint-Preux in Rousseau's novel The New Heloise, or Dido and Aeneas in Berlioz's opera The Trojans in Love, and Galois' invention of the theory of groups, or Euclid's presentation of the theory of prime numbers in Science. What appears implicitly in all of these is the decisive thesis of this entire little book, namely, a truth can only originate in an event. That a truth is universal makes it necessary to maintain that its process binds universality to pure contingency, that of the event. A truth appears in the world as the surnumerary connection of chance and eternity. This is why we can return to the plane tree in its poetic form, for surely such a connection is what Valéry has in mind when the plane tree responds furiously to the attempt to reduce it to its particular appearance, or, again, when it sets against this particularity its own inclusion within the universal. Let us read its response, hearing in Tempest the action of the event, and in its superb head the plane tree's incorporation within the universal consequences of the tempest, or a truth's advent in the world. This superb head is the glorious body of the transfigured tree, which is also thereby the generic equal of all that grows, with tree and grass joined under the fold of the true in fraternity. No, says the tree. It says no by its superb head's scintillating sparks, treated universally by the tempest as it does a blade of grass.